June 6, 1942. Somewhere in the western Pacific, the sea burns. The wreckage of what was once the mightiest carrier fleet in the world floats silently, broken and aflame. Black smoke coils into the cold morning sky, rising from the corpses of steel giants, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once thought invincible, now drifts helplessly across the waves of Midway Atoll. Far away, aboard his flagship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands alone. The coded message lies open in his trembling hands. His officers avert their eyes. The words confirm the unthinkable. 4 carriers destroyed, thousands of sailors dead, the heart of Japan's naval power gutted in a single day. The sea outside is calm. The admiral's face is not. He had designed the strike on Pearl Harbor. He had promised Japan 6 months of victory. And now, 6 months later to the day, he reads the price of that prophecy. No sound escapes him, except a whisper that only the ocean hears. A whisper born of defeat, duty, and disbelief. And in that moment, the man who once crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet finally understood who had truly sunk his own. In December 1941, Japan's empire stood at the peak of its power. From Tokyo to Singapore, from the South China Sea to the distant reaches of Micronesia, the rising sun spread across the Pacific like a storm. The Imperial Japanese Navy, sleek, disciplined, and battle-hardened, had achieved what no other force dared dream: the crippling of the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of that strike, was hailed as a national hero. Yet behind his calm eyes there was no triumph. Yamamoto, a Harvard-educated realist, had warned Japan's leaders years before. In the first 6 months of war with the United States, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But after that, I have no expectation of success. Still, Tokyo celebrated. Battleships smoldered in Hawaii's shallow waters. The Philippines faltered. Malaya fell. Even the British fortress of Singapore, once deemed impregnable, surrendered. The Pacific was a Japanese lake. But beyond the euphoria, Yamamoto understood the numbers. Japan's industrial strength was a fraction of America's. Its oil reserves were measured in months. Each new conquest stretched supply lines thinner. Every victory consumed more irreplaceable fuel. For all its glory, the empire stood upon a fragile foundation of steel and desperation. By early 1942, the Imperial Navy dominated the seas with its Kido Butai, the combined fleet's carrier strike force. 6 carriers, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, the most experienced pilots on Earth. They had swept across the Pacific like a blade. The Coral Sea, Java, Ceylon, everywhere they struck, Allied fleets recoiled. Yet in their victories, they began to believe themselves untouchable. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States was bleeding, but not broken. Pearl Harbor had not destroyed the American carriers. They were out at sea during the attack, and now they became the core of a new, leaner fleet. Under Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Pacific Command began to rebuild with quiet determination. Every damaged ship was repaired faster than thought possible. Every survivor became a lesson, every loss a reason to fight harder. But America's greatest weapon was not steel. It was information. In a dimly lit basement in Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts of Station Hypo worked day and night breaking Japan's naval codes. Their leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, had begun to understand the rhythm of Japanese communication, the subtle ciphers hidden within radio chatter. By spring of 1942, he had intercepted references to an upcoming operation, AF. The target was unknown, but the pattern was clear. The Japanese were preparing a massive assault in the Central Pacific. To the Imperial Navy, this was to be the crowning blow, an ambush to lure out and annihilate the remaining U.S. carriers. Yamamoto believed that only by destroying the enemy's carrier strength could Japan secure its empire. The chosen battleground, a small, barren atoll midway between Asia and America, Midway Island. From this lonely patch of coral, Yamamoto planned to trap the Americans, crush them, and finally force Washington to negotiate peace. He envisioned it as the decisive Battle of the Pacific, the modern equivalent of Tsushima, where Japan had once shattered the Russian fleet in 1905. What he did not know was that his enemy already knew his plan. The fate of empires now turned on a few men with typewriters, telegraph cables, and a hunch about a two-letter code. And as Japan's mighty armada began to sail, the Americans were already waiting for them at Midway. In Tokyo, Operation MI was considered flawless. The plan called for a vast, multi-pronged assault that would lure the weakened American fleet into a trap. Midway, a tiny outpost guarded by a few Marine squadrons and airfields, was the bait. Yamamoto's grand design stretched across thousands of miles, a complex ballet of ships converging in perfect timing. 4 of Japan's elite carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike first, destroying Midway's defenses and forcing the Americans to respond. Behind them, a powerful surface fleet, including the super battleship Yamato, would wait to finish off any survivors. Further north, another task force would feign an attack on the Aleutian Islands to distract U.S. forces. Yamamoto's confidence came not from arrogance alone, but from precedent. Every major operation since Pearl Harbor had unfolded with near-mechanical precision. His pilots were unmatched in skill, his naval crews drilled to perfection, his carriers the most advanced on Earth. He believed the Americans were still disorganized, still hesitant, still haunted by the shock of Pearl Harbor. What Yamamoto didn't realize was that his enemies already knew almost every detail of his plan. In the underground intelligence rooms of Pearl Harbor, U.S. codebreakers at Station Hypo had cracked the Japanese JN-25 naval code. Commander Rochefort and his team intercepted repeated messages about AF, the target of a major upcoming operation. To confirm their theory, they devised a ruse. They ordered Midway to transmit an open radio message claiming its water supply had failed. Days later, Japanese transmissions reported that AF was short on water. The deception worked. AF was Midway. When Admiral Chester Nimitz received this confirmation, he made his decision. The Americans would not retreat. They would ambush the ambushers. Nimitz was calm, calculating, and quietly daring. He had just 3 operational carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Together, they carried fewer than 240 aircraft, facing nearly double that number from the Japanese fleet. But Nimitz had something Yamamoto did not: foreknowledge. By late May 1942, the U.S. Pacific Fleet slipped out of Pearl Harbor under radio silence. They took up positions northeast of Midway, hidden beyond Japan's expected search range. On the atoll itself, Marines fortified runways, gun emplacements, and bunkers, while B-17s and torpedo bombers prepared for the inevitable assault. On June 3rd, the first Japanese reconnaissance planes appeared on the horizon. The trap was closing, but not on the side Yamamoto imagined. That night, the sea was calm under a silver moon. The Japanese fleet advanced with supreme confidence. Their carrier decks bustled with flight crews preparing the dawn strike that would annihilate Midway. Below decks, mechanics checked torpedoes and fueled planes. Pilots rested, some writing letters they would never send. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the first wave of Japanese bombers roared into the sky. Engines screamed across the dawn. Within minutes, Midway's runways were engulfed in explosions. The defenders suffered, but they held. The island did not fall. Reports returned to Admiral Nagumo. Midway's defenses were damaged but not destroyed. He ordered a second strike. To do so, his crews began rearming their planes below deck, a critical, fateful decision. Bombs were swapped for torpedoes, fuel hoses lay scattered across hangar floors, and decks brimmed with explosives. At that same moment, far to the northeast, American scout planes had found them. The coded message flashed across Admiral Raymond Spruance's bridge aboard Enterprise. Enemy carriers sighted, bearing 3 on 20, distance 180. The ambush had begun. The Pacific, vast and empty for months, was now the stage for one of history's most decisive encounters. A battle fought not for territory but for the future of the war itself. And as the Japanese prepared for their second strike, they did not know that high above the clouds, American dive bombers were already on their way. Engines humming, altimeters falling, and fate tightening its grip on the Kido Butai. One, the human angle, Yamamoto's burden. In the quiet corridors of the combined fleet headquarters, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto carried a weight that few men could imagine. Outwardly, he was a figure of calm precision, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, a strategist worshipped by his men. Yet behind his commanding presence was a man torn by duty and foresight. Yamamoto had spent years in America. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and admired the industrial might and ingenuity of the nation he now fought. He had attended baseball games, driven cars on open highways, and seen factories that never slept. He knew Japan could never outproduce the United States, but as a servant of the emperor, his role was not to question, only to act. He despised the war with America, calling it a reckless gamble. Yet when ordered to wage it, he planned the Pearl Harbor strike with surgical brilliance, not out of hatred, but to buy Japan time. Every victory since that morning had been to him the ticking of a countdown clock. Midway was the culmination of that clock's rhythm, the final throw of the dice before the industrial avalanche began. When Yamamoto's fleet sailed for Midway, his face was expressionless, his words formal. But those who knew him best recalled a subtle change, a silence at dinner, a long stare over the horizon, the melancholy of a man who foresaw his own defeat but marched toward it anyway. In that silence, history's great paradox stood embodied. The reluctant warrior who designed one of the most daring operations of the war, knowing it might also become his nation's undoing. The tactical angle, the fragility of perfection. The Japanese Navy prided itself on flawless coordination, a doctrine of precise timing, immaculate discipline, and mutual trust between air, sea, and command. For 6 months, this system had worked to perfection, but perfection is brittle. At Midway, that fragility began to show. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, faced the impossible. Split-second decisions under incomplete information. Should he launch the second strike on Midway, or rearm his planes to meet a possible American fleet? Should he wait for reconnaissance to confirm sightings or act immediately? In those indecisive minutes, chaos crept in. Planes returning from the first strike cluttered the decks. Below, hangars brimmed with rearmed bombers, half-fueled and stacked with explosives. Orders shifted back and forth. Torpedoes removed, then replaced, bombs swapped again. Each change meant danger. Each delay meant vulnerability. The Japanese doctrine left little room for improvisation. Every movement was planned to the second. But war, as Midway would prove, is governed not by precision, but by chance. At the same time, American forces operated on adaptability. Their carriers, under Admirals Spruance and Fletcher, worked in tight coordination but allowed flexibility in decisions. Pilots launched in loose formations, tasked to find and strike targets however circumstances demanded. The difference between Japanese rigidity and American spontaneity would, in the coming hours, determine the fate of the Pacific. The technological angle, the age of the carrier by 1942, the world's greatest battleships had been rendered obsolete, though few yet realized it. The Battle of Midway was not just a clash of nations. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare. Aircraft carriers had transformed the ocean into an airfield. Battles no longer depended on the horizon or the range of a ship's guns. They were fought by pilots who never saw the enemy face to face. Japan entered the war as the master of carrier warfare. Its Zero fighters were unmatched in agility, its dive bombers precise, its naval aviation doctrine decades ahead of its rivals. At Pearl Harbor, this innovation had rewritten the rules of naval combat. But by Midway, the Americans had learned quickly. The U.S. Navy's carrier groups, though smaller and less experienced, had adopted new tactics, coordinated attacks from different altitudes, integrated fighter screens, and the use of radar to detect enemy approach. Most importantly, they had learned how to endure. While the Japanese prized flawless execution, the Americans accepted imperfection and built systems that could absorb failure. Midway became the crucible that decided which philosophy of warfare would rule the sea. The battle would not be won by the largest ships or the deadliest guns, but by the coordination of information, timing, and chance, all harnessed through a few floating airstrips in a boundless ocean. At this stage, every factor, human, tactical, and technological, was converging toward a single point of tension. The next hours would test not only machines and strategies, but the very endurance of belief. The leadership angle, the calm before the storm on both sides of the Pacific, leadership would define the coming battle. For Japan, command rested on precision and hierarchy. For the United States, on trust and initiative, Admiral Yamamoto directed Operation MI from aboard his distant flagship Yamato, hundreds of miles away from the carriers at the front. His plan was vast, perhaps too vast. Communication stretched across radio silence, dependent on signals that took hours to relay. Commanders like Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo operated within strict parameters, bound to Yamamoto's prearranged plan. Once battle began, there was little room for interpretation. In contrast, Admiral Chester Nimitz operated with measured restraint and clarity. He delegated power to those closest to the fight, Admirals Frank Jack Fletcher and Raymond Spruance. Nimitz trusted their judgment. Spruance, a cruiser officer with limited aviation experience, relied heavily on his airmen, listening to their intuition. Fletcher, more cautious but seasoned, maintained composure even as chaos unfolded. Where Yamamoto's structure demanded obedience, Nimitz's system rewarded adaptation. It was leadership through confidence, not fear. The battle that was about to unfold would show how different philosophies of command could decide the fate of nations. The Japanese hierarchy produced unmatched discipline, but it also created hesitation. The Americans' flexibility, at times bordering on recklessness, gave them the freedom to seize fleeting moments of opportunity. And in war, seconds decide history. The enemy angle, misjudging the Americans for months, Japanese intelligence had underestimated the United States. They saw a demoralized, scattered enemy, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, still recovering. They believed American morale was brittle and that no commander would risk what remained of the Pacific Fleet in open battle. This misjudgment was fatal. What Japan failed to see was the quiet transformation of the U.S. Navy. The humiliation of Pearl Harbor had become its fuel. Shipyards in San Diego, Puget Sound, and Pearl Harbor worked day and night. Men who had never flown combat missions before were now hardened by raids in the Coral Sea. Every surviving pilot carried vengeance in his heart and precision in his training. Japan's naval staff also believed its own myth, that the Imperial Navy was invincible. They saw the Zero fighter as untouchable, their pilots as superior, their ships as sacred instruments of destiny. It was a psychological trap, the illusion of divine favor that blinds empires before their fall. To Yamamoto, this arrogance was poison. He respected his enemy too much. "I have seen the factories of Detroit," he once said. "I have seen the shipyards of Seattle. If war is prolonged, we will be defeated." Yet his warning was drowned by the fever of early victories. So when Midway approached, Japan believed it was setting a trap. In truth, it was walking into one. The moral angle, the cost of invincibility war, magnifies pride until it becomes blindness. For Japan, Midway was not simply a battle. It was a test of destiny. Generations had been taught that the emperor's forces could never be defeated. That belief was the spiritual armor of every pilot, sailor, and officer. But faith, when misplaced, becomes fragility. In the hangars of the carriers, young pilots prepared for what they believed would be another glorious victory. They wrote farewell notes to families, folded paper cranes, and tucked them into flight jackets. Their commanders spoke of honor, not survival. Every man was ready to die, but few were trained to adapt. Across the ocean, American sailors prayed not for glory, but for survival. Their motivation was simpler, more human: revenge, duty, and the faint hope of going home. They fought not for empire, but to stop one. At Midway, those two moral forces would collide, one fueled by divine certainty, the other by human resilience. And as the first rays of June 4th dawned, that fragile faith, that illusion of invincibility, began to fracture. The strategic irony: when the victor becomes the victim, Perhaps the greatest irony of Midway was that Yamamoto himself had designed the logic of his own defeat. The Pearl Harbor strike had been a masterpiece of deception, timing, and surprise. Now those same elements were being used against him. Yamamoto's brilliance at Pearl Harbor had relied on intelligent secrecy, coordination, and catching the enemy off guard. But by June 1942, the Americans had mastered those very tools. The hunter had become the hunted. The Japanese fleet sailed believing it held every advantage: numbers, experience, morale. Yet every move was anticipated, every signal decoded. The United States had become the student who learned too quickly. For Yamamoto, the lesson would come with a pain he could never undo: that in war, the more perfect a plan appears, the more vulnerable it becomes to chaos. And soon, chaos would descend from the sky. As dawn broke over the endless Pacific, shadows of aircraft stretched across the waves. Engines thundered, flight decks trembled, and men looked skyward into the sun, unaware that history itself was about to tilt. The stage was set. The fleets were in motion. The next act would be the storm. June 4, 1942, 04:30 hours. The sky above the Pacific was the color of steel. The horizon, a faint line of light. On the decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, hundreds of men moved in silence, fueling planes, arming torpedoes, tightening bolts. The carrier's decks glistened with morning dew and aviation fuel. The air smelled of salt, oil, and inevitability. Admiral Trichi Nagumo's strike force, the proud heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was ready. Their orders were simple: destroy Midway. Moments later, the first wave lifted into the sky, 108 aircraft roaring eastward. Fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, all rising like a metallic swarm into the dawn. Below, the carrier's crews bowed as they vanished into the light. By 0600, the American radar on Midway Island picked up the incoming formation. Sirens wailed. U.S. Marines scrambled to their posts. Pilots dashed toward their aircraft. Bombs began to fall minutes later, shaking the island's sand and coral. Hangars burst into flame, fuel tanks erupted, and black smoke rolled across the airstrip. But the island did not fall. American anti-aircraft guns roared back. Midway's air defenses were bloodied but alive. Nagumo received the report around 0700. Midway damaged, not destroyed. He frowned. The plan called for annihilation, not survival. The decision was immediate yet fateful. He would prepare a second strike. Below deck, armorers began rearming the planes for another attack on Midway. Torpedoes were removed. Bombs brought up. Fuel lines hissed as aircraft were refueled. Every corridor filled with movement, men shouting, lifting, rushing. The decks became powder kegs, and then the first crack in perfection appeared. A Japanese scout plane, delayed by 30 minutes, finally sighted something unexpected. American ships, carriers, Task Force 16. The message reached Nagumo as his hangar decks brimmed with rearmed aircraft. His crew stood between bombs, gasoline, and open hatches. The admiral faced an impossible choice: launch immediately with what planes were ready, or wait to rearm for anti-ship attack. Seconds turned to minutes, minutes into paralysis. The Japanese doctrine demanded order. He waited, but the Americans were already coming. 7:30 hours and the counterstroke begins from the decks of USS Hornet and Enterprise. Squadrons of American torpedo bombers and dive bombers roared into the sky. Their mission: find and destroy the Japanese carriers. They flew in scattered formations without precise coordinates over hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Many would never return. At 0920, the first wave, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet, sighted the Japanese fleet. Low, slow, and exposed, they dove toward the carriers. Japanese lookouts screamed warnings. Fighters, Zeros, dropped from the sky in packs, tearing through the American formation. One by one, the torpedo bombers were shredded by machine gun fire. Every single plane was shot down. Not one hit the target. Then came Yorktown's torpedo squadron, 12 more planes. They too were annihilated. Of 41 aircraft that attacked, only a handful of pilots survived. The Japanese carriers remained untouched. The air above them burned with falling debris and smoke. To the Japanese, it looked like victory, but below that chaos, something invisible had happened. The Japanese combat air patrol had been dragged low, all fighters focused on the doomed torpedo planes skimming the waves. The sky above, once protected, now lay open, and from that empty sky, death would soon descend. 20 hours and the sky opens at 10:20 a.m. 37 American Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown appeared out of the clouds. They had been searching blindly, nearly out of fuel, when a gap in the weather revealed the Japanese fleet below. 3 carriers sailed in formation, their decks loaded with fueled and armed aircraft. Nagumo's moment of decision now transformed into a fatal vulnerability. The American commander, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, didn't hesitate. He rolled his aircraft into a steep dive and released his bombs. The other pilots followed. From 14,000 feet, they plunged straight into history. Bombs tore through the sky, shrieking like judgment. The first struck Kaga, igniting her hangar deck. Within seconds, flames raced through the corridors. A second carrier, Akagi, took a direct hit amidships. Its deck erupted, torpedoes cooking off in a chain of explosions. Soryu followed moments later, ripped apart by 3 hits that turned her into a floating inferno. Japanese sailors ran across melting decks. Pilots were trapped in cockpits. Aviation fuel streamed into the sea, burning like liquid fire. By 10:30, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were dying. The ocean that had been Japan's domain now became its grave. As black smoke rose over the horizon, the remaining carrier, Hiryu, prepared to strike back. Its planes launched into the wind, racing toward Yorktown in a desperate counterattack. For Yamamoto's fleet, the battle was not yet over. But the tide had already turned. The counterblow, Hiryu's last stand at 10:40 a.m., while 3 of Japan's carriers burned behind her, Hiryu, the lone survivor, turned into the wind. Her decks were hot with sunlight, her crew silent except for shouted orders. Captain Tomeo Kaku and Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi knew they faced annihilation. Yet neither hesitated. They launched every aircraft they had left, 18 dive bombers, escorted by fighters, diving toward the faint radio signal of the American carrier Yorktown. At 11:10 a.m., the Americans spotted them. The sky filled with tracer fire as Yorktown's gunners opened up, their barrels glowing red. But the Japanese pilots were relentless, slicing through the flak and sunlight. Seconds later, the first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck. The second exploded deep below in the boiler rooms. Smoke engulfed the carrier. Men ran across scorched steel, dragging the wounded, dousing flames with hoses that hissed into steam. By noon, Yorktown was dead in the water. The U.S. fleet momentarily believed they had lost her for good, but her damage control teams fought back with iron discipline, keeping her afloat. When Hiryu's pilots returned, most never made it home. American fighters intercepted the survivors, cutting through the remnants of Yamamoto's once invincible air arm. Still, Hiryu's strike had shown Japan's spirit, a refusal to yield even as the sea itself turned against them. Admiral Yamaguchi, standing on his bridge, remained calm, resolute. He ordered preparations for another attack. But before his crews could arm the next wave, a shadow crossed the deck, 1500 hours. The American retribution at 3 p.m. Radar aboard Enterprise picked up the faint signal of returning Japanese aircraft. But behind them, something else, the position of Hiryu. It was the last of the 4 carriers still fighting. Spruance acted immediately. A fresh strike group, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet, took off into the glare of the afternoon sun. At 5 p.m., they found her. From 10,000 feet above the Pacific, the pilot saw a single carrier steaming alone in the dying light, her deck bristling with activity. The sea around her shimmered orange, reflecting the flames of the other 3 still burning beyond the horizon. The Americans rolled into their dives. One by one, the Dauntlesses plummeted. Bombs screamed downward, 500-pounders tearing through the thin decks. One struck near the forward elevator, another exploded amidships, another aft. Fire engulfed the Hiryu in seconds. Below deck, fuel lines burst, torpedoes detonated, and the carrier shuddered from within, as if the ocean itself had crushed her heart. Admiral Yamaguchi offered evacuation, refused to leave his ship. "I shall stay with the Hiryu," he said. "May the Emperor be forever victorious." At 8 p.m., the carrier was abandoned, Hours later, she slipped beneath the waves, taking Yamaguchi and hundreds of sailors with her. The sun set on a blackened horizon. Japan's Kido Butai, the world's most powerful carrier force, was gone. The message far away, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the transmission. The coded report was brief, stripped of emotion. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all lost. The admiral's hands trembled as he read the message. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a nation's pride and his personal prophecy fulfilled. He had promised 6 months of unchecked victories. Midway marked the end of the 6th month. Witnesses later recalled that he said nothing for a long time. His officers stood motionless. The sea outside was perfectly still. Finally, Yamamoto removed his cap, bowed his head, and whispered almost to himself, "So, it has come." Those nearby said his eyes welled as he turned away from the map table. A moment of private grief from a man the world had thought unshakable. He knew what few others yet realized. The empire's momentum had broken. The pride that had driven Japan's conquest would now become its burden. The night sea as darkness fell, the remnants of Yamamoto's fleet retreated west. Destroyers prowled among the fires, searching for survivors. The water was slick with oil, bodies, and debris. Thousands of Japanese sailors clung to floating wreckage, singing hymns to the emperor that faded into silence one by one. American ships held position miles away, their crews watching the fires burn long into the night. The air smelled of salt and smoke, the scent of victory mixed with horror. At 2 a.m., the Akagi was scuttled. Then Kaga, then Soryu. The thunder of explosions rolled across the waves like distant thunderclaps, echoing the death of Japan's naval supremacy. Above them all, the stars shone coldly, indifferent witnesses to the fall of an empire's pride. By dawn on June 5th, the Pacific was quiet again. Only the rising smoke on the horizon marked where Japan's dreams of invincibility had died. For Yamamoto, the war had changed forever. His fleet, once the instrument of terror, was now a ghost of its former self, and in his silence, somewhere between grief and inevitability, a Japanese admiral wept. The morning after Midway, when dawn broke over the Pacific on June 5, 1942, the ocean was eerily calm. The smoke that had blanketed the sky the previous day still drifted on the horizon, black columns marking the graves of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. What had once been the pride of Japan's naval might now lay beneath the waves, twisted metal tombs for more than 3,000 sailors. The scale of the loss was unimaginable. 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, the very core of its naval aviation, gone in less than 24 hours. Alongside them vanished hundreds of irreplaceable pilots, mechanics, and flight officers, men trained through years of discipline and experience. The Japanese Navy could build new carriers, but it could not rebuild those men. For the Americans, the scene was one of stunned triumph. The Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, which would itself be lost days later to submarine attack, had achieved what few thought possible. They had halted the Japanese advance and turned the tide of the Pacific War. The victory at Midway was not simply military. It was psychological. Just 6 months earlier, the United States had been on its knees, its fleet shattered at Pearl Harbor, its army retreating across the Philippines, its allies collapsing across Asia. Now, with a single battle, that narrative reversed. At Pearl Harbor, America had learned humility. At Midway, it rediscovered confidence. The numbers behind the shock and pure arithmetic, the loss was staggering. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and over 300 aircraft. More than 3,000 men perished, the finest naval aviators the empire had ever produced. The United States, by contrast, lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, and around 150 aircraft. Fewer than 350 Americans were killed. The difference wasn't just numerical, it was generational. Japan's carrier air wings had been formed through years of elite training programs, producing pilots whose skill and coordination were legendary. But such mastery came at a cost. The program was slow and selective. By losing those aviators, Japan lost an entire class of expertise that could never be replaced in time. For every fallen Japanese pilot, America could train 10. For every sunken carrier, America could build 5. By 1943, the U.S. Navy would commission a new Essex-class carrier every few months. Japan, strangled by limited resources and Allied blockades, could only watch as its early advantage dissolved. Midway didn't just level the playing field, it reversed it. A nation in denial in Tokyo, the official reports were vague. The Imperial Navy initially concealed the full extent of the defeat. Newspapers spoke of a temporary setback and fierce fighting near Midway, but the truth filtered slowly through whispers and rumors. Officers' families received no details, only the cold formalities of condolence. Behind closed doors, however, the Naval General Staff understood the magnitude of what had happened. The Kido Butai, the offensive spearhead of the empire, was gone. Japan had lost its ability to conduct large-scale carrier warfare. Admiral Yamamoto, ever the realist, bore the responsibility quietly. He blamed himself for the complexity of the plan, the overconfidence it fostered, and the misjudgment of American resolve. But more than that, he felt the loss as a spiritual wound. For the first time in his career, the admiral who had run wild for 6 months faced the reality of decline. Witnesses described him in the days following Midway as withdrawn, contemplative. He smoked endlessly, pacing the deck of Yamato, speaking little. To some, he seemed aged by years in mere days. The victory he had given Japan at Pearl Harbor now haunted him, for it had taught his nation to believe it could never fall. And now, that belief was gone. The Pacific Ocean, once ruled by the rising sun, had turned against it. The balance of the war had shifted, not just in ships and numbers, but in spirit. For Yamamoto, and for Japan, Midway was not the end of the war. But it was the end of illusion, the Emperor's silence. In the weeks that followed Midway, the shock reached the highest levels of Japan's government. Emperor Hirohito received the reports in his quiet study at the Imperial Palace. The figures were unbelievable. 4 carriers destroyed, thousands of sailors gone. The flower of Japan's naval aviation extinguished. The Emperor said little, but the silence in that room spoke more than any outburst could. The illusion of divine invincibility, that the gods of war favored the empire, had been shattered. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan's leaders faced the truth. They were fighting a war they could not win. Yamamoto's personal report to the Emperor was brief and somber. He accepted full responsibility, his voice calm, his expression unchanged. Those who stood beside him noted that he did not attempt to justify or soften the loss. His only words of comfort to the imperial court were, "We did everything that could be done." But privately, Yamamoto was inconsolable. He wrote to close colleagues, expressing despair at the scale of the loss, not only of ships but of men he had trained and trusted. Each ship name, each pilot lost was a personal wound. In one letter to a fellow admiral, he admitted, "I am tormented by the thought that I led so many of our finest men to death. I cannot escape the weight of their absence." The turning of the tide in Washington, the mood was the opposite. The victory at Midway electrified the nation. Newspapers across America declared it the turning point in the Idaho Pacific. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a decisive blow and commended the Navy for its courage and intelligence. But even as the headlines celebrated, the men who had fought there knew how fragile the victory had been. Many American pilots never returned. Their courage had been bought with the blood of those who had flown low, died first, and paved the way for the decisive strike. In naval history, Midway became synonymous with audacity, proof that foresight, intelligence, and luck could overturn even the most overwhelming odds. Strategically, it marked the end of Japan's offensive momentum. Never again would the Imperial Navy seize the initiative in the Pacific. From this moment onward, it would fight on the defensive, retreating from island to island as American forces advanced with relentless force. By 1943, U.S. carriers, submarines, and long-range bombers began to close Japan's supply routes. The empire that had once stretched from the Indian Ocean to Hawaii began to crumble under the weight of attrition, and at the center of that reversal was the ghost of Midway, a battle that had lasted less than 3 days, yet determined the fate of the Pacific for the next 3 years. The fall of Yamamoto in early 1943, Yamamoto continued to lead, though his spirit had dimmed. His every order carried the gravity of a man fulfilling duty rather than destiny. He knew his empire was burning out, but he refused to abandon it. That April, American intelligence intercepted another Japanese transmission, this time revealing the itinerary of an inspection flight over the Solomon Islands. The message had been sent in the same overconfident code Japan still used after Midway. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters ambushed Yamamoto's transport plane over Bougainville. It crashed into the jungle, killing him instantly. When his body was found, his hand still clutched his katana. His death, like his life, was both noble and tragic, a man of foresight undone by the very system he had served. In Tokyo, the nation mourned. Official broadcasts described him as a martyr, the guardian spirit of the empire. But to those who understood, his death symbolized something deeper, the silence that follows realization. He had once warned Japan's leaders that their victory window would last 6 months. At Midway on the 6th month, that prophecy had come true. The echo of Midway years later, historians would call Midway the fulcrum of the Pacific War, the moment when the tide turned, slowly but irrevocably, toward Allied victory. For the men who survived, it was remembered not with celebration, but with quiet reverence. Pilots who watched the Japanese carriers explode never forgot the sight, nor the understanding that war, in its fury, consumes all heroes alike. For Japan, Midway was a scar that never healed. For America, it was proof that courage and intelligence could overcome despair. And for Admiral Yamamoto, it was the day his genius met its inevitable truth, that even the greatest strategist cannot command destiny. The sea eventually reclaimed the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They rest today in silence, thousands of feet below the waves, monuments to arrogance, brilliance, and sacrifice. Their shadows still linger across the Pacific, whispering the lesson Yamamoto understood too late. The Battle of Midway was more than a turning point in a war. It was a reckoning between pride and reality, genius and fate, empire and endurance. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, it was the cruelest of ironies. The man who had once struck the most daring blow in naval history lived long enough to see his own strategy mirrored and turned against him. The same precision, deception, and timing that had made Pearl Harbor a masterpiece became the instruments of Japan's undoing. Midway revealed a deeper truth about warfare, that intelligence, adaptability, and humility can outweigh strength, tradition, and pride. The Americans did not win because they were invincible. They won because they learned. Every mistake at Pearl Harbor became a weapon at Midway. Every weakness became a lesson. Yamamoto, the reluctant warrior, understood this too late. His tears, whether shed in silence or spirit, were not for his lost fleet alone. They were for the inevitability of what was to come, a war that would consume his nation, his navy, and his dreams of controlled victory. In the end, Midway was not about numbers, ships, or even strategy. It was about realization. It marked the moment when the empire of the rising sun began to sink, not beneath the waves, but beneath the weight of its own certainty. And as the ocean closed over the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, it also closed over an era, the last age of the samurai at sea. For Yamamoto, and for history, the lesson endures. Power may command the waves, but truth always returns with the tide.